Well, we had a meeting on the site.
All right, we're going to get ready to go here in just another minute. I see we have quite a few attendees in the webinar. Thank you everyone for showing up. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. The first thing that I'm going to do is share a video to get us started and get us in the mood for this panel on Paul Robeson, and then I'll make some more general introductions. So the first thing I'm going to do is share this video from his performance at the Sydney Opera House, Paul Robeson. And if you could just if someone could give me a thumbs up that they can hear it.
Well, we had a meeting on the site.
Yeah, okay.
And Robeson was introduced to the workers, and he spoke about his relationship with the workers in other countries because he was a prominent figure in the international working class movement.
He must know something, but don't say nothing. He just keeps rolling. He keeps on rolling along. He don't plant taters, he don't plant cotton. Them that plants them is soon forgotten, but old man River, he just keeps rolling along. You and me, we sweat and strain, body all aching and racked with pain. Tote that barge, lift that bale, show a little grit, and your land's in jail. But I keeps laughing instead of crying. I must keep fighting until I'm dying. And old man River, he'll just keep rolling along. And this is one about Joe Hill, one of our great heroes in the American working class movement. They framed him on a murder charge, but his spirit still lives in the hearts of all the American working class. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. In Salt Lake City, Joe, says I, him standing by my bed. They framed you on a murder charge, says Joe, but I ain't dead. Says Joe, but I ain't dead. And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, says Joe, what they can never kill went on to organize, went on to organize. From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill, where working men defend their rights, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Joe Hill.
Just a moment. All right, thank you, everyone. I'm so glad to have everyone here, and I wanted to start off our panel by with a song and a visual, so that we could get Paul Robeson in our mind. My name is Maria Kennedy. I am the co-director of the New Jersey Folk Festival, and we have invited 6 panelists: Jorge Aravelo Matias, Michael Gabriel, Erica Gorder, Vincent Pilote, Bill Westerman, and Shanna Redmond here to discuss Robeson today, along with a pre-recorded conversation with musician Josh White Jr. I'll be introducing each guest as we move through the panel. We'll open up the forum to questions from the audience after all the panelists have spoken. And please use the chat if you'd like to engage in discussion with other attendees. If you'd like to ask a question to the panelists, please enter it into the Q&A. So at this point, I'd like Ray Bess, one of our interns, to take it away and introduce this part of the program for us.
Yes, thank you. Hi, my name is Ray Bess, and I'm the curatorial intern for the Folk Festival this year. And this program is part of the New Directions in Folk stage of the New Jersey Folk Festival, which is presented by the Department of American Studies at Rutgers University in New Brunswick and the New Jersey Folk Festival Incorporated. Funding for the festival is provided by the School of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers University, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Middlesex County Office of Arts and History Folklife program. We have a full schedule of the virtual festival events throughout April, so please visit the event calendar on our website at njfolkfest.org. And the clip that you were just watching, it shows Paul Robeson singing to the construction workers who were building the Sydney Opera House, organized by the Building Workers Industrial Union during his tour of Australia in 1960.
Thank you so much, Ray. So the New Jersey Folk Festival has a long history of featuring singer-songwriters in the tradition of the folk revival. And looking through the lens of social and racial justice movements from the past year, we wanted to think about how the genre of folk music has been influenced by these movements in the past and where it might be going in the future. And so this was born our New Directions in Folk, part of our New Jersey Folk Festival program. And that includes this panel and also a virtual concert on Saturday, so please tune back in for that. It seemed natural to investigate the legacy of one of Rutgers' most famous alumni, Paul Robeson, as part of this endeavor. And so with that, I want to ask our first panelist to help set the stage for us. And our first panelist is Michael Gabriel. Michael has written 4 books on New Jersey history, all published by the History Press. In 2016, his book, New Jersey Folk Revival Music, explored the history of folk music in the Garden State and included a chapter on Paul Robeson. Michael is also a board member of the New Jersey Folk Festival. So Michael, I wanted to ask you, in your book, The New Jersey Folk Revival Music, you look at the development of folk music in the state. So what was folk music like at the point where Paul Robeson enters the scene?
Thank you, Maria. Obviously, folk music goes back many, many hundreds of years in the United States. But the point that I think worth making is that the greater awareness of folk music, which led to the folk revival, was through a folklorist named Cecil Sharp. And in 1915, he had a theory. He went down to North Carolina, gathered songs that he believed came over from Europe, from England in particular. Sure enough, he was right. He transposed them, brought those songs to Camden, New Jersey, which, if you follow my radical logic, is where the folk revival began. Not New York City, not Cambridge, Massachusetts, but Camden, New Jersey. That's where the Victor recording studios were. And Cecil Sharp recorded these songs. And that renaissance, or that re-examination of folk music, really led to the start of folk revival. There were many folklorists, Cecil Sharp included, that thought that this music, this poetry, these songs of the people were something that was very important, something that should be recorded and cataloged and preserved. And Paul Robeson was actually at the very beginning in those early years, right in the middle of the folk and folk revival start. In 1927, there was an A&R man for Victor, Ralph Peer from East Orange, New Jersey. He went down to that very famous recording session down in Bristol, Tennessee, Virginia, and he brought back with him two very famous artists, Jimmy Rogers and the Carter family. And again, that's really the start of when the folk revival mix began. Folk music, as we know it, is basically it's music that's handed down by the generations. It's the original author has been lost or has been forgotten. It's formulaic in style. It has a lot of cliches, and often it has a utilitarian property to it, like sailors hoisting the mast of a tall ship. Folk revival basically is a commercial enterprise. It takes the structure and the spirit of folk music and builds upon that. And then that's where you have the advent of singer-songwriters like Jimmy Rogers, like the Carter family. And it's a mixture of traditional songs and new music. So that's really where the folk revival scene began in the 1920s. Paul Robeson, he comes on the scene. He gave a recital at the Provincetown Playhouse in New York City in 1925. And I'm more than certain that there were some people from the Victor Studios were there and listening to him. They signed into a recording contract. And on July 16, 1925 was his very first recording session at the Victor Studios. And from there he went on. He was obviously very talented, went on to a tour of Europe. He recorded Old Man River with the Paul Whiteman Orchestra in March of 1928. And Paul Robeson saw the connection between Negro spirituals and the folk music from all different countries. And he would sing Negro spirituals, but he would also sing folk music from other countries and sang them in their native tongue, which is, he was very talented enough to do that. And here's a quote. "Sing me your folk songs and I'll tell you about the character, customs, and history of your people. Folk songs are the poetic expression of people's innermost nature, of the distinctive and multifaceted conditions of its life and culture, and the sublime wisdom that reflects that their great historical journey and experience." So he was right there in the very beginning, really where the separation was between folk and folk revival. But from my point of view, there really isn't that much of a separation. I know that academic folklorists think so, but it's a grand continuum. It's all part of the great musical tradition. So I will be good, and I will say that's when I think I'm right on target with 5 minutes.
Thank you for setting a good standard, Michael. I think the continuum that you talk about is going to be something that comes out in all of the conversations we're having today. So I like that you bring that up.
Yes.
And we'll come back to that idea. At this point, I'd love for my student intern, Ray, to introduce our next guest, Erica Gorder. Ray has been working with Erica on understanding what's in the archives about Paul here at Rutgers. So Ray, take it away.
Yes, so our second panelist this evening is Erica Gorder, and Erica is an interim university archivist and previously was an associate university archivist at Rutgers University since 1998. She earned her master's degree in history and archival studies at New York University and a master's in library and sciences degree from Rutgers University. The Rutgers University Archives serves as the final repository for the historical records of Rutgers, the state university, and Erica has worked as an archivist at the New Jersey Historical Society and as well as the Rutgers Institute of Jazz Studies. So Erica, with your work on the special collections and with the Paul Robeson collection, you've looked deeply into Robeson's experiences at the university. So can you share with us what some of his musical experiences were like and how they influenced his later career?
Sure, Ray. Thank you so much for asking that question. It's a big question, and hopefully I can answer it in the time allotted. I'm going to try to share my screen. I have a couple images that I thought would be nice. Let's see if it works. If it doesn't work, well, we'll see. Let's see here. Well, it's really not working for me. Hold on a second. Well, I'm going to stop. I think I'm going to give up on the images at this moment.
It was almost there, Erica.
It was almost there. Let me try it one more time.
Try it again.
I was having a hard time before getting out of PowerPoint. So
started as a slideshow.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. Oh, for heaven's sakes. Okay. There we go. Okay, can everybody see that? Yeah. So there's Paul Robeson. So as you know, his college achievements showed an unparalleled breadth and depth. Much of our attention towards Robeson has focused on his athletic and oratorical genius. But I've had the opportunity, working in the archives, to take a bit of a deeper dive at his time here at Rutgers, particularly his social and creative life. So as you can see here, he was on the baseball team, the football team, basketball team, track and field. He's well known for his football prowess. He was also a masterful orator, and in the debating association, you can see some pictures of him here, football team. He was in the debating association. He also received high grades in all of his subjects. He was in the math club. Many people don't know that. He was in Phi Beta Kappa in his junior year, and he was elected in his senior year to the Cap and Skull Honorary Society. This was an award given for all-around excellence in athletic scholarship in the arts. Well, so what about the arts? Where is music and the arts for which he became so well known? And this was the sort of question that I had in my mind. It's like, okay, we know all this. I want to know, or did he sing? Was he in the Glee Club? So I would want to give you a little bit of background. In the early 20th century, there weren't really curricular offerings in the creative arts, and few, if any, extracurricular clubs, except the Glee Club, which we'll talk about later. During this time period, there were also so few Black students at Rutgers and in New Jersey that those students formed their own kind of collegiate social network that included Robeson, his roommate here, Robert Davenport, and his girlfriend, Jerry Neal. She was a student from Freehold who attended Teachers Normal School. And Robeson spent a lot of time outside of New Brunswick and off campus with his group of friends, attending and organizing social events together. And there they are. There's another photo of them. He went home nearly every weekend, and he sang at church. His father was a pastor, of course, as you probably already know. There was also an extensive electric trolley system, and of course the train in New Brunswick. And I think this transportation hub really facilitated Robeson's artistic and cultural experiences. So what about musical clubs at Rutgers? What about the Glee Club? Despite his well-known singing prowess, Robeson was not officially listed as a member of the Glee Club in any archival sources. So there are different accounts as to why this is so. I was still completely shocked, to why wasn't he in the singing group? And there are different accounts as to why this is so. Some say he was a member, but he could only sing during home concerts as a soloist or as a guest. And by some accounts, this is probably true. He did have solo singing engagements with the Glee Club. And evidently he used those guest singing engagements with the Glee Club to publicize all of his other concerts that he was doing, which evidently in New Brunswick and the region, which were quite frequent. So the reason he could only sing with the Glee Club locally, and you can see a picture here of a dance. This is a dance in the Ballantine Gymnasium. And there were also social events after football games and whatnot. He couldn't really participate in a lot of these social events because, and particularly the Glee Club, simply because the Glee Club traveled and went out of town a lot. to perform. And because of Jim Crow and segregation, Robeson would not have been able to attend any of the social events that were associated with these performances. So even when he was in the football team, he often couldn't go out to dinner after those football games. And the same would be true for the Glee Club events. He wouldn't be able to go out and socialize or even be let into some of the venues. So this is probably one of the reasons why he couldn't be an official member. But he did sing when he was at Rutgers. So he performed in New Brunswick and other venues throughout the state in New Jersey, including Trenton and Freehold. And he did a lot of church events. He was a member of the YMCA, so there were a lot of YMCA events where he sang. Other service organizations that he was involved with. Yes, he was in many different organizations while he was a student and doing so well at Rutgers. He also performed at charitable and fundraising concerts and also informal social events and parties. He sang popular music of the time, love songs, especially at parties. He made the girls swoon, evidently, and spirituals. In fact, one newspaper review of one of his concerts mentions his rendition of Deep River, for instance. And here's one of the concerts that this was in the newspaper, Glee Club and Robeson's as a soloist. And here are a couple other ads from newspapers that mention some of his musical and singing engagements when he was a student again. So a little bit about summer work, and I mention this for a very specific reason. So when he was 15 and throughout college, he worked at the Imperial Hotel in Narragansett Pier in Rhode Island. And these kind of popular summer resorts drew a lot of African-American college students for summer work. So when he wasn't working, though, he was socializing with a particular group that included Black students, Native American and Jewish locals from the Rhode Island area. And they did a lot of singing performances and they staged plays in Narragansett. And also they hung out on the beach a lot, of course. And I mentioned this aspect of Robeson's life as well as his collegiate network and singing at other types of engagements, because while Rutgers College didn't offer any formal musical training or that kind of musical experience for him on campus, his social life off campus did. So what I come away, from Robeson and his time at Rutgers is, of course, as many of you know, his abundant energy and brilliance. He did so much in his 4 years at Rutgers than most people can do in a lifetime. And I think, thinking about how this influenced his later career, I think he was so fully engaged and so charismatic and inquisitive. He excelled in so many areas. I don't know if anybody would have predicted what his profession was going to be. There were a lot of people that said he was going to be the governor of New Jersey, that he was going to be a famous lawyer and an activist. So people thought he was going to do a lot of different things. He ended up going on to study law at Columbia University. He lived in Harlem and he received his law degree in 1923. So when I think of what was happening in Harlem during his time, right when he graduated, he moved into New York City. I picture him as the time of the Harlem Renaissance and the Jazz Age, one of the most important cultural moments in American history. And I sort of picture him going to the Cotton Club and doing all sorts of cool things. But he was part of the Harlem Renaissance and he knew many of the famous figures there. But interestingly, and I think one of our panelists will talk about this, he wasn't a huge fan of jazz. He did warm up to it later. But it will probably come as no surprise that by the early 1920s in New York, Paul found his artistic calling. In 1921, he joined the chorus of Noble Sissel and U.B. Blake's Shuffle Along. And he also was in some of his first plays, particularly Eugene O'Neill plays, which was mentioned before. It was actually his experience working with Eugene O'Neill and the Provincetown Players in this early period that his wife, Essie, said was really responsible for him ultimately pursuing the arts as a career. That sort of sealed the deal, was working with Eugene O'Neill. It was on Emperor Jones and All God's Children Got Wings. So his commitment to social justice and his global perspective, which included extensive travel, exploration, study of languages. I think he knew 20 languages. Formally and informally, he studied them. I think this is part, this goes back, when he was a college student, he was so vivacious and he was eager to learn. And I think it carried over, and I'm not surprised at all that he would become interested in, social justice, globalism, and all cultures and their music around the world. So that's the long answer to your question. Thank you so much, everybody. And I will stop that.
Thank you so much, Erica. Ray, if you could introduce our next guest, who will carry on the jazz question, I think.
Yeah, so our third panelist this evening is Vincent Pilote, and Vincent Pilote is a senior archivist and digital preservation strategist at the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. Vincent has compiled discographies on Billie Holiday, Lionel Hampton, and a discography on the Commodore Records label. Mr. Pilote is one of the contributors to the Oxford Companion to Jazz, and he's written a number of album program notes on Lee Konitz, Johnny Smith, Mary Lou Williams, Benny Carter, Curtis Fuller, and more. So, Vincent, as an archivist at the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers, you have insight into the other kinds of African-American music that was prevalent in Robeson's time. So how did he align or differentiate from other African-American performers and genres of his time?
Okay, that's that's interesting. As Erica pointed out, he was part of the Harlem Renaissance movement. I don't know if he actually did attend any of those clubs, as she mentioned, because he really was conflicted, or his feelings about jazz was sort of complicated. He really didn't. He considered it to be a decadent genre, and he wasn't the only one. I mean, it was a common feeling amongst a lot of the middle class and upward Blacks at that time, who were not that impressed with jazz, because it was basically a dance music. It was considered kind of a lowbrow music. They were much more interested in Black artists doing Western classical music, in fact. But he did become sort of an admirer of the jazz of the 40s and the 50s. So he came around eventually. And I got that mostly from a gentleman named Anatole Schlosser, who was a faculty member at York University in Toronto, who wrote a dissertation, his doctoral dissertation on Robeson's performance life. He didn't have any problems with Black spirituals, Negro spirituals. And while he recognized the blues as an important tributary of Black musical culture, he really didn't have much of an affinity for the form. Nevertheless, if you look at his discography, you'll discover that he did record the blues twice in his career. In February 20th, 1934, while he was in London, he recorded W.C. Handy's St. Louis Blues with a group of unknown musicians, possibly from Ray Noble's band. He was a British band leader, probably best known for composing the tune Cherokee. In October 1st, 1941, in New York, he recorded the infamous King Joe, which we're going to talk about as soon as I can share my screen here. Let's see, share. Let's see if I can get mine to work. Okay, everybody see that? Is everybody seeing that?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, Paul Robeson and jazz. Now, King Joe was written by Richard Wright, who was a Black author from the Harlem Renaissance and a boxing aficionado. He loved boxing, and he was very much enamored, like most Blacks at the time were, of a heavyweight champion, Joe Louis, who was considered, well, he was called the Brown Bomber. And he was very popular to Black folks who didn't have a lot of heroes at that time, especially on a national scene, but Joe was considered a hero. And so Richard Wright collaborated with Paul Robeson. There's Richard Wright on the left, Paul Robeson in the middle, and there's Count Basie. And this tune was brought to Basie by Richard Wright. And Basie was one of the preeminent swing bands of the time, a solid jazz band. I mean, there were jazz bands, there were dance bands, there were street bands, and Basie's was considered a swinging jazz band, dance band. And so they brought the recording to him, or brought the tune to him, and Basie agreed to record it. And it's one of the oddest things in the Count Basie discography. And I'm going to play you excerpt of it so that you can hear what it sounds like, and you can kind of judge for yourself. That's Spacey on piano. It's Buck Clayton on trumpet.
Black-eyed peas as cornbread, what makes you so strong? Black-eyed peas as cornbread, what makes you so strong? Cornbread say I come from where Joe Louis was born. Lord, I know a secret, swore I'd never tell. Lord, I know a secret, swore I'd never tell. I know what makes old Joe hook and punch and roll like hell. They say Joe don't talk much, but he talks all the time. They say Joe don't talk much, he talks all the time. Now you can look at Joe, but you sure can't read his mind.
I think you get the idea. As you can see, it says King Joe Part 1, and that means that there's a Part 2, which is on the other side. So it's pretty long, 3 minutes a side, so that's 6 minutes long. And it was issued on the OK label, OK 6475. And also, this was not the first attempt. This was several attempts before they actually got it right. There are alternate takes to this, which you can find if you really want to hear them. But overall, after this whole thing was over and done with, Count Basie turned to producer and friend John Hammond and had a comment that I'm going to post here, and that will be the final word. And that's pretty much, I have to agree. I mean, he gives it a good shot, but he really isn't a blues singer. But hey, listen, he tried. And that's all I got. Now stop sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vincent. I think it's really interesting to consider, all the different genres he worked in and,
sure.
Which ones worked and which ones maybe not so much. I mean, he still sounds great. But
he does. And I found it interesting that he actually did do St. Louis blues earlier in his career. And so he did record, the blues before he did King Joe, but, he really didn't have an affinity for the music. That really wasn't his thing.
Well, the next person I want to bring up on stage is Bill Westerman. Bill Westerman is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and coordinator of the program on ethnic and immigration studies at New Jersey City University. He also teaches in the New Jersey Scholars Program and has previously taught at Princeton, Goucher College, the Macaulay Honors College at CUNY, Villanova, and Rutgers. So Bill, I'm going to bring you to the front here. So, Bill, I wanted to ask you to talk to us from the view of folklore studies. You've been interested in the legacy of the whole folk revival movement in terms of how we understand the relationship of music to communities, especially marginalized ones, and music as a vehicle for social movements. So how do you think Robeson's legacy complicates our understanding of the folk revival era and of the social movements he was a part of?
Great question, and thank you for inviting me today. I think Robeson complicates this in three ways, broadly categorized. The first of these, which seems really as relevant today, if not more relevant than before, was in complicating the racial politics of the folk revival, or the racial invisibilities. When we think of the major figures of the folk revival, we generally think of white performers and promoters. And musicologists, Pete Seeger, Mo Ash, Alan Lomax, of course, the Weavers, the Almanac Singers, even Bob Dylan, maybe problematized a little bit, Joan Baez being Latina on her father's side, but mostly it was a white movement. Perhaps I'm overlooking some African-American performers, so correct me if I'm wrong, if the other panelists know of other figures in the folk revival. But other than Robeson, it's a pretty white movement. Maybe Leadbelly, but he was part of a whole larger blues movement that was still an active tradition and really didn't need a revival. We'd now look back and say that to the extent that these performers and promoters were drawing on African-American material, as well as Anglo-American material, it bordered on cultural appropriation, which is another topic worth exploring. But that said, Robeson was uniquely performing African-American folk materials as part of a rich cultural tradition, some of which was still actively in circulation, even by groups such as the very important Fisk University Jubilee Singers going back to the 19th century, and some less well-known among white audiences at least, which was music that was subject to being, quote unquote, revived. And I think that the Jubilee Singers and the work done at Fisk University, the folk song collecting by Thomas W. Talley, an early folklorist who, although his day job was actually as a chemistry professor, is work very much in the history of American folk song scholarship that has really gone unrecognized in graduate programs and in the history of folklore studies in America. Second, Robeson complicates our notion of the folk revival because of the way he addressed genre, which in his own way was revolutionary. He sang traditional spirituals, but made a point to perform them as what is called art songs in concert halls, as classical American music, thereby, quote unquote, elevating them. It's a very different milieu from the folk songs of the folk revival, and yet in many ways he was constructing a folk revival of his own, if you will. There were white critics who were not ready to accept these spirituals and other traditional songs as the sublime material they are. But Robeson implicitly challenged the notion of folk or traditional as being somehow inferior to classical. While there were some in the classical world, notably Antonin Dvorak and George Gershwin, who attempted in a way to do the same thing, especially with jazz. And then in Europe, you had a number of European composers, Brahms, Liszt, Bartók, working with Romany materials or in Romany musical idioms. Really, we'd have to go back to an American like Scott Joplin to find another unique figure in American music history who tried to build that unique bridge across genres from the popular to the orchestral or classical, or in Joplin's case, the operatic. And third, I would say that Robeson challenges the folk revival through his inclusion of what he called songs of free men, global political songs, many emerging out of the Spanish Civil War, some from the Russian Revolution, or others from American labor history, such as Joe Hill. These were not just revived as concert pieces, but also became part of the folk song active singing tradition among ideally what was called in that beautiful YouTube clip, the international working class movement. But more precisely, it was his left-wing followers, supporters of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, among others, for whom these songs became traditional. Just as We Shall Overcome or We Shall Not Be Moved would become traditional songs of the civil rights movement later on. So it was he was participating in a folk song revival of sorts, but these songs that he introduced through the concert stage mostly took on new traditional lives and circulation of their own among followers, particularly on the American left. So I would say for those, in those three particular ways, that is really how he complicates a more kind of monochromatic, monolithic notion of the American folk song revival that we normally or previously have had.
Thanks so much, Bill. I think that there's lots of activity in the chat about who should be considered, and I think lots of ideas about genre, and I think we'll come back to that. But I want to keep moving and introduce our next guest, Shauna Redmond, because I think she's going to help take what you're talking about in terms of his scope and his internationalism and help us understand that a little bit better. So I'm going to bring Shauna to the front here. Shauna Redmond is a public-facing scholar and is the author of Anthem, Social Movements and the Sound of Solidarity in the African Diaspora, and Everything Man, The Form and Function of Paul Robeson, which was named a Best Book of 2020 by NPR. In 2019, she contributed the critical liner essay to the vinyl soundtrack release of Jordan Peele's film Us. She is a professor of musicology and African American studies at UCLA. So Shauna, I was so happy that you were able to join us. Your book, Everything Man, The Form and Function of Paul Robeson, really investigates how Robeson continues to influence our culture today. How do you see his radical internationalism, particularly in his musical career, present in contemporary movements for social justice?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's really important to always insist on placing Robeson in the world because that was his stage. It was his platform. He worked vigilantly to ensure that he was connecting to audiences well beyond the contiguous United States, even at some point, as many of us know, singing over the border to Canada in order to reach audiences who were otherwise forestalled from meeting him with the intimacy that he strove for in so much of his performance career. And of course, that prohibition was instituted by the US State Department, who revoked his passport in 1950, refusing to allow him to access those communities that he had built decades worth of relationship with based on his political beliefs, based on his investments in socialism, based on his investments in anti-colonialism and his outspoken support for both civil and human rights, as well as the rights of working people all around the world. And so I want to speak a little bit to this moment of 1950 to 1958, when his passport was revoked, in order to announce the ways in which he was a forebearer of so much of what we understand of contemporary social movements. I mean, of course, under the circumstances in which we see each other currently, we understand how significant distance is and how it can become an incredible hurdle to building common language, to building solidarities. But this is something that Paul Robeson understood very well during this period of the 1950s. And so he set some models already for how best to communicate and be in solidarity with one another without proximity, without physical proximity. And it's something that contemporary social movements certainly have taken full advantage of even pre-COVID, right? The use of social media, for example, as an incredible organizing tool in building campaigns, both domestically and internationally. You see that amongst Black collectives who are working in solidarity with Palestinians, working in solidarity with Fees Must Fall activists in South Africa, working in solidarity with students at the US-Mexico border, as well as Mexico City and Central America. So all of these things are happening without being in the same space. And Robeson becomes a kind of really significant model for making that possible. So I want to speak to just one of his performances during the period of his passport revocation as a means of announcing how he used technology differently. And it's a technology that to us is not technology in the way it was at that point, which is the landline telephone, right? This is something that is almost obsolete in our contemporary life, but at the time at which he was utilizing it in the 1950s, early 1950s, it was newer technology, and the capacities of it were constantly being challenged, especially if you think about making international phone calls. Domestic, they got there pretty quickly, but international was far more difficult. And so I want to speak to one event in which he used the telephone to communicate internationally, and all through the singularity of his magnificent voice and his musical capacity. So I'm going to read just a brief passage from Everything Man in order to kind of set the scene for this concert, and then end with his voice, which is where everything, I think, should start and end, his singular voice. So this is a concert that he had in 1957 with Welsh miners. And while he was in New York and they were in Porthcawl, South Wales, they had a communication. They had a moment of celebration with one another, and this is the scene. Robeson's ability to send himself under the ocean was by invitation of the National Union of Mine Workers of South Wales, who were eager to receive his hologram. Familiar with the union and its workers at least since the early 1930s, Paul's relationship with organized labor proved to be his lifeline during much of the decade. Their call for his participation, which they'd made yearly since 1953, was met with another call that was also a response that allowed him to join in their Eisteddfod, a musical festival and competition that the union began to host annually in South Wales in 1948. The miners' efforts were separate from the national Eisteddfod, which continues to take place in a new Welsh city every year. Organized historically by choral singing in the hymn tradition, especially male choirs, the form of the Eisteddfod, which celebrates Welsh language and culture, is a fitting connection to Robeson, whose childhood was filled with hymns and whose spirituals became a part of that global canon as well. Though he is regularly credited with bringing Negro spirituals to Wales, the Fisk Jubilee singers visited in the late 19th century and were influential in expanding the national choral culture. The Welsh familiarity with spirituals and the ease of musical progressions facilitated through shared language and tonality made this occasion of a joint concert between Robeson and the National Miners Union Choir of South Wales a musical alliance of international proportion. Joined by his wife and comrade Islanda Good Robeson, son Paul Jr., who often served as his recording engineer, daughter-in-law Marilyn, grandchildren Susan and David, and accompanist Alan Booth, Paul sang to them in May 1957 from a studio in New York City. By this point in his national detention, he was exceptionally familiar with do-it-yourself sessions. His independent Othello Records had produced a number of records for audiences outside of the United States. His kineticism behind the microphone was readily transferred by his chosen songs, and in the process, his body too was live, even as it was meant for preservation in wax. Songs are a way to get to singing, as singer, activist, scholar Bernice Johnson Regan described. The singing is what you're aiming for, and the singing is running through your body. You cannot sing a song and not change your condition. The studio was a place of teleportation for Robeson, and the pressure of his surrounding world created new conditions and states of matter as he sublimated from solid body to gas voice without ever losing his density. The request from those who called was that he be present in as literal a form as possible, and so he contorted himself in whichever way was necessary to ensure that his response was poignant and enduring. Paul remained with the Union on that day for more than an hour, making recognition a possibility without a line of sight. And he began that concert, as he did most, by singing what he called his songs, his people songs, the Negro spirituals. And so I want to play from that recording, that very recording in 1957, his rendition of Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel, which I believe from my listening of it was the most profound of that day.
We're not hearing it. You might want to reshare and make sure to click share sound.
Okay. I'm going to see if that helps. Okay, let's try this again. You hear it?
No. Oh, yes.
Did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, and why not every man? He delivered Daniel from the lion's den, Jonah from the belly of a whale, and the Hebrew children from the fiery furnace, and why not every man? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel, and why not every man? The moon runs down in a purple stream, the sun refused to shine. Every star did disappear, yes, freedom shall be mine. Did my Lord deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel? Did my Lord deliver Daniel? Why not?
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shauna. That was really moving. And that was on the telephone between New York City and Wales.
All on the telephone, yes.
Amazing. I'm going to move to our last guest, which is Jorge Arevalo Mateus. Hope I got it right, Jorge, this time. I'm going to bring you to the front. So I'm going to introduce Jorge, but then this is kind of a dual presentation of Jorge and myself, and we're going to speak to Josh White Jr., who was, I know, mentioned in the chat as another folk revival musician who is African American, and we brought him in, for this reason. So just to introduce Jorge Arevalo Mateus is a PhD in ethnomusicologist, co-founder of the Woody Guthrie Archives, and former director of the Alan Lomax Archive Association for Cultural Equity. He is an adjunct professor of ethnomusicology and race and ethnic studies at BMCC and Hunter College, CUNY. Jorge is an active musician, composer, music, and radio producer, producing the weekly radio program and podcast Hurdy-Gurdy Songs on Radio Free Brooklyn, which he is doing in collaboration with us this week. As we're going to talk, he has a program specifically about Paul Robeson. So when we were thinking about doing this panel on Paul Robeson, Jorge got in touch with me and suggested that we invite a musician with a tangible connection to Robeson himself, which is how we got in touch with Josh White Jr. And Josh White Jr. is the son of Josh White, the legendary folk musician. He has been performing as a singer, guitarist, actor, and social activist for 77 years. He has released 25 albums, starred in 4 TV concert specials, toured the world, and has been awarded Tony Awards for acting, named the Voice of the Peace Corps and the Voice of Vista, and honored with several humanitarian awards. And so we are going to show, I'm going to show here before I talk with you, Jorge, we're going to show a conversation that we had with Josh White Jr. that's pre-recorded. So we're going to share just a few minutes of this conversation with Josh. And, I think we really wanted to have a musician's presence, as part of this panel. And Josh was so gracious and kind to do this with us. So Let me just bring this up on my screen. Oops. Just go back a little bit here. Okay. Can you all see the screen? Yes, okay. Oh, wait a minute. Pardon me.
You got it. How did you become aware of Paul Robeson? Was it through your father's life and career or more personally?
Through my old man. He was one of many people who were friends of my dad's who did music and who happened to be Black. And a lot of those performers my father knew were mostly white doing that kind of music. So he kind of stood out in that respect. Also because he was such a big man, especially to an 8-year-old.
What do you think that Paul Robeson's legacy or contribution has been to the American story writ large as such?
Well, the fact is that he's a predecessor. He was the one that we all have generations of people who bring out things that we have to speak about and to, and they do it in different ways. Some are just speakers, some use music, and that is something that I respected and loved about Paul, that he not only spoke on it, but he could put music to it. And to speak it is wonderful, but then when you put those words to a melody, that touches people more, and that is what I'm all about. And I'm grateful for that exposure of him doing that.
I was, what struck me with the first time I heard Paul Robeson, and I'm sure most people, is just the power of his voice. And it has such an interesting sound to it. And I was wondering, what you thought of his voice, or how it impacted you as a musician.
Well, we all have our sounds when we sing, and he had a sound that no one else really touched, and so it stood out. And it also let me know that I don't need to try and sound like anyone or try and do a song the way they would do it, but to feel it. They felt it, and they felt it that way. I've got to hear those same words and chords and see how it touches me, and it'll come out that way. Whether it comes out close to who I learned it from, I don't know. But I know when I feel comfortable after putting a song together, I always feel I know where it came from, but I can feel and hear me and how I do the song.
That's so interesting because, part of what we're trying to do with the festival is to highlight, the ways that songs move from one generation to another and how they move from one person to another. And I think the way that you described it it really shows how each individual person puts their stamp on a song, but it still has what came with it.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, do you have any thoughts on the way that folk musicians, or not just folk musicians, because all kinds of musicians have interpreted songs that Paul made famous. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, that is a progression that naturally happens with music. You never know how or when or who, but that's a progression that music is. Yeah.
Do you have a favorite Paul Robeson song that you love to sing even still?
This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine. I love that a lot. I do that a lot. And it's funny because a lot of people who do not know who made it famous will sing along with me. I'm going to start singing and say, join me. And people jump in all the time.
Would you like?
I'm going to stop there because there's so much more. And we actually have the full interview with performances from Josh White Jr. on our YouTube channel. So I encourage you to go there and look for it. It's really delightful. We're going to try and play a little more at the end of our panel. But I want to ask you, Jorge, if you could talk a little bit about, what you learned from talking with Josh White, but also about what you were interested in the first place, which is that how these songs move, from such a singer like Paul into other zones, other musicians, people who are doing covers of songs that he did. And I'm just thinking of this quote that Shauna brought up in her talk, where she quoted another person whose name I can't remember, but she said, "Songs are a way to get to singing." And I think that's something that Josh White Jr. really brought up, is that idea that songs are a way to get to singing, and realizing your own voice, but also connecting with the message that other people sang it with in the past. So could you tell us a little bit about your motivation for your upcoming, and tell us about your radio program that's coming up?
Okay. First of all, thank you, Maria, and thank you. It's really wonderful to be on this panel with these wonderful scholars and friends, I hope. Yeah, a couple of things that I learned that I wasn't aware of, and it was kind of surprising because having worked with the Guthries and the Lomaxes and so on, and the Seegers, you would think that I was much more familiar with Paul Robeson, but he was always kind of like the sunshine way in the back that was always there, but wasn't out forward, in a way that was very, very clear. And I think that one of the things that's wonderful about the festival this year is that you are putting this forth, and I really thank you for that. The other thing was really that I think I never realized what a global communicator that he was, and I think that very few singers speak, in relation to what you're saying that Josh White Jr. brought up. I think that very few singers have been able to match their voices and emotions to a repertoire of songs that communicate a global vision for the world, such as it is, as well as Paul Robeson. So that was very surprising to me. My motivation was really to produce a program, an episode for a radio podcast, internet radio program that I do called Hurdy-Gurdy Songs. It's on the Radio Free Brooklyn network. Tomorrow it will stream live. I hope that you will listen to it, radiofreebrooklyn.org. And the inspiration of Robeson was initially to present his, first of all, his repertoire is just so vast. I mean, even if you just focus on one area, like the spirituals or traditional folk songs, or even the art songs of Dvorak, etc., it's so huge. So to curate a program for 1 hour, I had to really, really focus. And what I came up with was the idea of some of Robeson's more popular songs, as he popularized them, made them well known, and then they in some way they have gotten somewhat lost. Some of them, in the historical mist, as it were. But the duos, I would come up with duos for these cover versions, and I call this series Uncover, the Uncovers, because it's to discover the original recording, the song, and then pair it with an artist. So, for example, with Shenandoah, I'll go through a couple here. Shenandoah, it's Robeson and Bruce Springsteen. Waterboy, Robeson and the Don Shirley Trio, a jazz classicist, composer. Scandalize My Name, Paul Robeson and Ida Maria, who is a Swedish rocker, Scandinavian rocker. No More Auction Block, Robeson and Dylan. The House I Live In, Robeson and Frank Sinatra, and Sinatra there with Count Basie's band. The House Joe Hill, of course, which I paired Robeson with Joan Baez, and it's been covered by many other artists, Billy Bragg, Phil Oakes, Ani DeFranco, and Utah Phillips even do an instrumental version, commemorating Joe Hill. Old Man River, interesting pairing, Paul Robeson and the Blue-Eyed Soul Brothers, the Righteous Brothers, Lonesome Road, which is Robeson, I paired him with Rhiannon Giddens. This Little Light of Mine, of course, I had to pair Paul with Josh White Jr. and Amazing Grace, Robeson with Leanne Rhymes. So the long and short of it is just the incredible weaving through of these songs that are Robeson, their Robeson kind of stamp is on them. And again, like Josh White and Maria was mentioning, this weaves through the culture. This is what becomes not just American culture, but it becomes a world culture because he was this global communicator. So that was my motivation for all this.
Thank you so much, Jorge. I think, one of the things that I was really excited to see from all of our panelists, and especially sort of ending up with you and our conversation with Joshua Jr. was how Robeson became, moved from his roots here in New Jersey and became a national and a global figure, and how he continues to be musically influential, socially influential, in ways that some of us aren't even aware of. I honestly didn't really know that much about Paul Robeson until I came to Rutgers. But the more that I began to learn about, the songs that he covered and the movements that he was a part of, it was almost like he had been there the whole time, and I just didn't really know that much about it. So, and I think there's a lot of people who are probably in the same boat, and I'm really really grateful for all of our panelists for uncovering some part of Paul Robeson's life and career and influence. And I really hope that if you've been interested in this panel, that you'll go to our webpage, njfolkfest.org, and there are bios of all of the participants on the panel today with their book titles and other kinds of information. So if there's something about what they spoke about that moved you, please go search them out and find out more. At this point, I want to see if, I know it's past 7. I know some of our panelists have to get off to other things. So I do want to thank you, but we're going to keep it open for Q&A. If anyone has to jet off, we're really grateful for your presence here. But if you can stay for some Q&A, we do have, I want to invite my my students who are managing the Q&A to come on and tell us if there are any questions that are there for the panelists to chew on. So if Emma and Lalitha, could you unmute yourselves and tell us if there are any questions in the Q&A?
Yes, we have one question from Steve Spiegelbaum. Thank you for your question. He says, I've heard much from Pete Seeger about his Peekskill experience. So can you speak about Peekskill from Robeson's perspective?
I wonder if there are any of our panelists who would like to tackle that one. I see Michael Gabriel. You want to jump in, Michael? Thank you so much, Lalitha.
This Peekskill event became a real flashpoint. There was a concert that was set early, I think it was 1949. It was postponed, and then it was held about a month later. Paul Robeson was the headliner, and he performed with the Weavers, and there were a few other artists as well. And that was the episode where there was the famous poster, "Wake Up America," Peekskill did, and there was it was quite there was a performance, but then there was a riot afterwards, and the performers, their cars and their buses were stoned by people, and all sorts of racial slurs and things like that. They were very unpopular with a lot of America in those days, and that's when everybody was rooting out communists from every corner, and people didn't appreciate socialist ideas. So that was a flashpoint. One thing I can just say in passing, yes, many people consider Paul Robeson, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger to be radicals in their day, so to speak. And no doubt they probably made some mistakes along the way, the album Songs for John Doe. I'm sure they maybe could have done things a little differently. But here's the thing, calling them radicals, I mean, that's half the story. What were they fighting against? Well, think of the time, 1930s, 1940s. This was a period of very vicious anti-Semitism. This was a period of Jim Crow. This was a period of lynchings. So this is what they were up against, racial discrimination. And so they fought against this and became very unpopular. So yes, if you want to call them radicals, fine, but think of the other side of the coin. There's, people who were trying to organize unions in steel mills and factories were getting their heads bashed in by corporate goons. So this is what they were up against. And their stand, and their very strong stand, and their very clear stand, made them very unpopular and give them the label as radicals. So that was part of the Peekskill event way back when. So.
Thank you so much, Michael. I wanted to ask if after this discussion, if any of our panelists had anything that they wanted to ask each other, or things that stood out in some of your colleagues' comments that moved you or was interesting to you. Any little bit of free-flowing conversation. Yeah, Jorge, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question for Bill. Bill, you brought up this racial invisibility term idea. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I actually was just typing into the chat. I have a class at 7, so I was just about to duck out, but I will say that.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. No, it's because it's an important point. I think going back to the early days of the history of American folklore studies, that there's been great influence placed on the Anglo-American tradition and the work that was done in the East Coast universities, and really ignoring very important work in folklore that was done particularly at the HBCUs, and particularly around first the collection of narratives of people who survived enslavement, but then also the collection of traditional African-American songs, rhymes, and so on. And so as part of the canon formation, if you will, of American folklore studies, the work of Black American folklorists or Black American intellectuals who are working with folk materials has really been, I would say, invisible. Publication has been, at best, delayed many years. I mean, look at Zora Neale Hurston's most recent book, which was in manuscript form for something like 90 years before it was finally published. So that's what I was generally referring to about the invisibility. And people raised some really great questions in the margins about Black performers and the folk revival. And I think one of the things that strikes me is that a number of the performers, the SNCC Freedom Singers, the Georgia Sea Island Singers, they were working very much with living traditions. I don't think of them as necessarily as revivalists. Bernice Johnson Reagan also is a folklorist and performer, but I don't think of her as someone who is reviving a tradition in a kind of popular style outside of that tradition. So that was definitely, I think, Odetta was a very important figure that I overlooked. And probably Richie Havens as well. But I think when folklorists talk about a folklore revival or talk about revivalism, they're talking in some ways about an artificial revival of a tradition that is no longer active, current, and viable. Whereas the freedom songs, the songs of the civil rights movement, and the spirituals were very much an ongoing tradition, with direct roots right back to the 19th century.
Yeah, very much so. Songs for freedom.
Yep. See, I wouldn't call that a revival. I would, they're very much, we're very much living tradition by the middle of the 20th century and continue to be part of the living tradition.
I'm just seeing some comments in the chat, Marilyn.
Yeah, Hampton Folklore Society, absolutely.
Yeah. Marilyn White, soon to be our president of the American Folklore Society, says the Hampton Folklore Society is really important in the late 1800s. And Marilyn, graduated from Hampton University, but there was never any mention of the society. So, thanks. I'm so glad you're chiming in, Marilyn. Thank you. Any other points of discussion amongst the panelists? There are several more questions we can get to in the chat, but I wanted to let you guys bring up some points yourselves if there was anything else.
I need to
Yeah.
run. I'm sorry, but
Okay.
thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Bill.
everyone. Look forward to more conversation.
I do have one more question from the chat, and this is from Tamara Samuel Siegel. She asks if someone could speak to how Robeson's legacy managed to rebound from his blacklisting and destruction of his recordings and his confinement in the United States. And to what extent has this effort at erasure been repaired? Maybe if Shauna is still here, I wonder if you could address any of that.
Sure. I have my toddler next to me, so if you hear voices or see a head, that's who it is. But actually, that is the kind of core of my book, was actually trying to track how he returns, why he comes back to us. But what I found is actually he never went away, right? That there are so many ways in which he was always already present for us through his recordings, most certainly, right? The abundance of them, many of which came to light of day well after the blacklist was assumed complete, right? During the period of his post-retirement in the 1960s, when he lived a very quiet life in Philadelphia. But his recordings, absolutely, he still appears in visual art. So even people like Hank Willis Thomas, who as recently as last January had a show here in LA where Robeson was twice featured. There are all of these ways that he's returning to us. And I think a lot of that has to do through other of these folk traditions like poetry. Gwendolyn Brooks wrote a poem dedicated to him. Nikki Giovanni wrote a poem dedicated to him. Pablo Neruda wrote a poem dedicated to him, right? All of these people and artists who continue to carry his name, his legacy. And so at the same time as he's returning, he also is like Joe Hill, I never died, says he, I never died, says he. He's always been here. People continue to call on him, to revive him, to tell stories of having met him, of their parents having had dinner with him, grandparents, etc. And also, again, placing him in the proper context, places in the rest of the world where the erasure was not as complete as it was in the United States. In Wales, when I was doing research, I was encountering people younger than myself who knew his name and were animated in their response to me at having been given the opportunity to speak about him. In South Africa, where I've traveled, other places, people know who he is. And it's for the fact that erasure by the State Department in some respects made him more famous around the world, right? That people battled for him, they supported him, they loved him. And so for him to have been so well preserved everywhere else has absolutely reversed flow back to the United States, such that there has been a recurrence, a continual resurgence of investment and curiosity about him, because we need him still.
I think that's such an I was so amazed to read your book, Shauna, and just find all of the ways in which you direct our attention to the reanimation of Paul Robeson and the ways in which he never died. I never died, says he. And I think I'm going to take this moment to plug our own effort to send the music along and to revive. And so to that extent, I'm going to share my screen here for a moment. And I'm going to share this is our New Jersey Folk Festival website, and we have a social media stage this year. So if you are not one of the people who we've invited to perform at our virtual events, we still want people to participate actively and interactively. And so our social media stage is an opportunity for all of you out there to record and share your versions of songs that were made famous by Paul Robeson or that are inspired by the music and work of Paul Robeson. We've given you several prompts here, which are all versions of Joe Hill. I never died, says he, which I think is a really great sort of message to keep in your mind as you might record your own version and share it with us. And you can, all of these, we've got Joan Baez, we've got Bruce Springsteen, we've got Pete Seeger, and we've got Paul Robeson singing to the Welsh Miners up here to inspire you. And we would love for you to record your own cover or original song inspired by this, and then post it on whatever social media you use and tag at New Jersey Folk Fest, at NJ Folk Fest, hashtag NJ Folk Fest, and keep the music moving and keep the song and the spirit of Paul Robeson alive. So please participate in that. At this point, I'm just going to thank all of our panelists for participating today. I'm going to take us to the gallery view so we can everyone take a wave, take a bow. This has been such a learning experience for me. I've learned so much from each of you. You've all brought a really unique and important part of Paul Robeson's contributions to our attention. And I'm really glad that you could all be a part of this panel. I do want to let our audience know that we have lots more on our schedule for the Folk Festival this year. This is just the first of several panels and performances, which will occur on Mondays will be panels, Saturdays will be performances through April 24th on Rutgers Day, when we will have a live broadcast from the Woodlawn Mansion of more music. Please check out our website for the full schedule of events, www.njfolkfest.org. And I'm going to close out our panel today with, I'm going to share my screen and share some more of the Josh White Jr. performance that he recorded for us.
Maria, can I
yes?
ask something? Can I ask
Yeah.
something, please?
Sure.
If any of the songs cover versions, I would be more than happy to play them on my next episode of Hurdy Gurdy Songs. So if anyone wants to submit one, and please, we will be airing the Robeson special in partnership with the New Jersey Folk Festival tomorrow at 2 p.m. at radiofreebrooklyn.org.
Oh, thank you so much, Jorge. And so that is extra incentive for all of you out there who might like to put your own version, your own stamp of a song. You might get on the radio. So do it well. All right, I'm gonna share some more of Josh White Jr. Performing for us, and I'm gonna play us out here. You're welcome to stay and listen. Thank you, everyone, so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Alive as you and me, says I to Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, said he. I never died, said he. In Salt Lake City, Joe, says I, standing by my bed. They framed you on a murder charge, says Joe, but I ain't dead. Says Joe, but I ain't dead. The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They shot you, Joe, says I. Takes more than a gun to kill a man, says Joe. I didn't die, says Joe. I didn't die. And standing there as big as life and smiling with his eyes, says Joe, what they could never kill went on to organize. Went on to organize. From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill where workers defend their rights to live, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Joe Hill. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me, says I to Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, said he. I never died.
All right. I see we still have some attendees watching. I hope that you will go to our NJ Folk Fest YouTube page and look for the rest of the performance from Joshua Jr. We're also going to be playing some more of those songs at our virtual New Directions in Folk concert on Saturday, which starts at 7 p.m. We will also be live streaming that, and you can sign up for the webinar for that performance also on our webpage, njfolkfest.org. So thank you everyone for attending. We're really pleased to have, we had such a nice audience today.